Welcome to Rehash, a Web3 podcast.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Rehash, a Web3 podcast. I'm your host, Diana Chen, and in this episode we are talking all things privacy, digital identity, surveillance capitalism, Web3 search, and so much more. Lots to talk about today, and we've got Anastasia Uglova, who is the head of communications and ecosystem development at Lighthouse, a Web3 search platform, here with us today to talk about all of these things. Welcome, Anastasia. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for inviting me. Hi, guys.
You were nominated and voted on by the community, so you've got to thank all the people in our DAO for nominating and voting you on. Don't thank me.
Well, I'm thanking whoever was paying attention to what I was writing on Mirror. I feel like I'm screaming into the void most of the time.
Oh my gosh, you have so much good stuff on Mirror. I want to dive into all of that. But first, for people who aren't familiar with you and your background, can you just share a little bit about what your background is, what you were working on before Web3, and how you initially got into Web3 and started working in this world?
Okay, so it's got a little bit of a twisty, windy thing to it. So bear with me. I didn't start out in crypto or blockchain space at all with this privacy quest that I've been on. So I've always been interested in identifying and isolating the conditions that lead to human thriving and that reduce human suffering. So I started my career actually in politics in Washington. I was born in Russia, moved to America, and I was really interested in why do nations fall apart? So I started working at actually Cato Institute. I was a podcaster way back when in 2006. Way out of my depth, daily interviewing journalists, senators. It was crazy. I was 20 years old. Maybe it was 21. And from there, I moved into media. So I worked at NBC for a while. I worked at NPR. I also worked for about 6 years in Rwanda, working in women's education and workforce development. Again, because I'm always in pursuit of what leads to human thriving and what reduces human suffering. What's the biggest mission that I can identify where I can have an outsized impact? And I was primarily working in technology in East Africa. So ed tech, really. And when I wanted to come back to the States, I was like, what does it mean to work in tech in America? I've been for 6 years in Rwanda. It's a totally different landscape. What am I even going to do in tech? And it was 2016, Cambridge Analytica scandal happened. And for me, it was this light bulb moment. Because again, US citizen, but Russian birth. So it hits different. It was just this visceral call to action. I know what my role in tech is going to be, and it's going to be figuring out consumer privacy. So when 2020 rolled around, there was just a bit of downtime to go to grad school. I always wanted to go back to grad school. And I just earned my Master of Science in Information Security and Privacy at UT Austin. And what I was chiefly concerned with is identifying the primitives that result in surveillance capitalism so that we can stop it. And that's kind of how I came to crypto. I figured out that a lot of it stems from how we mismanage identity. And once I unlocked that and figured out that user custody, also known as self-sovereign identity, is a really big unlock for that, it was kind of impossible not to play in crypto, because that's where all the change is either going to be made or not made. It will just repeat the whole thing all over again.
Yeah, that is a lot of plot twists, but all of it comes together in the end. It really makes sense now looking back. So before we dive into everything, let's just set the stage for people, make sure everyone's on the same page about what we're even talking about here. So when we talk about digital privacy, and more specifically in the context of Web3, crypto privacy, what are we even talking about exactly?
Privacy has been so historically difficult to define because it's such a personal thing. People have different expectations and boundaries around privacy, depending on what context they're in, who they're talking to. I might want a lot less privacy if I'm trying to transfer medical records between doctors, but I might want significantly more privacy if I'm sharing details about how I spent my weekend, and then maybe my family is involved in part of that. And so maybe I don't want to share everything. But because it's been so difficult to define, it's also been really difficult to adjudicate and protect because there's no single definition of it. Historically, I guess the first foray into figuring out what privacy was written by Warren and Brandeis in A Right to Privacy. It's this, I think, 1890 essay in the Yale Law Review that talked about how a man's house is his castle, and really defined the idea of where does a person have reasonable expectations of privacy? If someone is intruding on their home, that's private and it shouldn't be intruded upon, but in the public, Then there's no expectation of privacy, so that's probably okay. And then there was like tort law, which is mostly about like harms to self. So like if someone steals your name or likeness or intrudes on your seclusion, meaning like someone intrudes on a place that's just yours, or casts you in a false light, or discloses private facts about you. But these are like specific harms that you can go to the court of law for. That doesn't really speak to how we experience privacy every day in digital spaces, right?
Yeah, so when we think about how we experience privacy every day in digital spaces, I think, you mentioned a couple of sort of extreme examples, like if your health data got leaked, that would not be okay. I think most of us can agree on that. And if you're posting something publicly on Twitter, you can expect, very little privacy there because you're intentionally posting it publicly. I think like these extremes we can agree on, but it's like the middle part of the spectrum where there's a lot of gray area and a lot of debate about whether our privacy has been invaded or not. When we think about digital privacy, though, are there certain facets of privacy that we should always be thinking about, or maybe that we should always be guaranteed, like sort of underlying principles that we can apply to all of these specific situations?
So difficult. I think the really interesting thing to point out is people forget that there was no data breach of Facebook's records in the Cambridge Analytica scandal. It was all data that was publicly available. So 87 million Facebook profiles were harvested based on the poorly architected privacy protections that Facebook had at the time, and not because the data was like locked down through information security and someone accessed it. It was freely available. And they're really small things like your like patterns. With 200 likes, a study has shown that it's possible to figure out whether you're going to divorce your partner. So an algorithm can really figure out a lot more about you based on your like patterns than you may even know about yourself. So it's not these really obvious, like personally identifying information that puts you at risk, like my health data or my date of birth, right? Or where I live. It's really just who my friends are, who I tend to talk to, what I like to purchase, where I like to hang out. All of these things kind of form a picture of me as a person that makes it possible to model what my behavior would be and decide how to target me for certain outcomes. And this can be as innocuous as serving me the right ad at the right time so I can buy the pair of sneakers because I'm sleep deprived and I don't know, okay, I just need some like retail therapy, to swaying an election, right? So when we talk about privacy in crypto, it's really interesting that we, first of all, don't, not as much as I'd like to see, because we're putting so much of our information on chain. And again, it's not this very like high risk personally identifying information or PII that goes on chain. It's just our patterns of interaction. But that's exactly what was at stake in the Cambridge Analytica scandal. It was all freely available. There was no data breach. Likewise, there's no data breach when you look at an Etherscan and try to figure out, okay, what does this wallet like to do? What other wallets does this person or does this wallet interact with? And how can I target this wallet or a group of wallets so that I can sway them or perform what I like to call concealed influence? So not influence that you're aware of, such as like I'm at a store and I see an advertisement for something and I know it's an advertisement. I have the medium is the message. It's showing me this is an advertisement. But in online spaces, you very often don't even know who's influencing you, who has information about you, and information about you is control over you.
Right. So what this brings up for me is this question about consent, right? So it almost sounds like you're saying that the Facebook breach, there was no breach. It was all of it happened, the way that it was allowed to
Yeah.
happen. And so then the question becomes, well, did we consent to having all of this data be freely accessible and used in whatever way by Facebook or by whatever apps we're using? And then in the context of Web3, that reminds me of, Evan McMullen always talks about consent. And there's no consent layer on the blockchain. So can you talk about this idea of cognitive consent that, I've seen you write about on your mirror and tweet about? What do you mean by cognitive consent, and how does that play into our digital privacy in both, Web 2, the world that we're used to, as well as Web 3 that we're trying to build right now?
Yeah. So cognitive consent is actual informed consent. what we think of right now as informed consent, which is like when you get that cookie pop up on a website, which was required by the GDPR, or even when you get served a term of service, like 10 pages of legalese that you know you're never going to read, or an end user license agreement. Technically, that's informed consent. You've been informed and you have consented. And so who knows what's going to happen on this platform with your data, right? But that's not cognitive consent. It's actually performative consent. Cognitive consent is like when you have actual brain active awareness of what you're consenting to, exactly what you're consenting to, how your data is going to get used. If you don't know what's being done to your data, you are actually being violated. And I think this is a really important thing to kind of double click on. Why do I say violated? We think it's really about our bodies. Like if someone touches us without our consent, we feel violated, right? We should have the right to say, or to revoke consent, or to say, like, I only want to be touching my shoulder, but not my arm. This seems very obvious to us. But with data, we feel kind of separated from it, which is really weird because our data is actually ourselves. And increasingly, our peripherals, like our computers, are ourselves. It's really important to understand that. Like, look at computers. We began with like very large computers in our basements, right? And then they moved on to our desktops, our laptops, our pockets, our wrists. Eventually, these become brain-computer interfaces. Like, that's not science fiction. We understand that there are companies that are pursuing this. It's eventually going to happen. It's actually essential for the metaverse, which is just the next iteration of the internet. So these peripherals, these devices have very measurable impact on our psychology, on our like brain chemistry. They affect us, right? And so we should have consent over how we're being affected by these devices in the same way that we have consent over who touches us in a physical space. It's really essential that we begin to understand this because as we live more and more of our lives online, we have to kind of evolve a different way of thinking about the digital sphere as being a lot more real than we allow ourselves to expect it to be. We still think of digital as like, well, it's just a computer, but it literally changes whether you feel depressed, whether you feel happy, who you interact with, what beliefs you ascribe to, how you vote. These are very real, tangible repercussions. And so consent in digital spaces should be treated as much, if not more seriously than physical consent, because we're spending more of our time in digital spaces.
Wow. Yeah. I feel like I just need a minute for that to sink in. That is so true. And I think that's something that we just don't think about enough. And for some reason, our minds still haven't made that connection between, like, we're still separating the physical from the digital when, the digital has caught up with our physical lives, I think, faster than a lot of us have realized. Something else that I've read about a lot in your mirror and your Twitter is about surveillance capitalism. And I think a lot of us, have heard this term. We've probably used it at some point, but you do a really good job of breaking down the different aspects of surveillance capitalism. Can you share a little bit about, what those aspects are and how that applies to, our digital privacy?
Yeah, so this is actually what I was focused on figuring out in grad school is how do I construct a sufficiently robust privacy moat around every citizen in the metaverse or any emergent environment such that the costs of enacting surveillance capitalism become too onerous for companies to pursue. So it just becomes like not a viable business model. It's done, right? Because it's just too costly to do it. So what is surveillance capitalism? It's the idea of monetizing our data exhaust, the data trail that gets left behind by our internet activity, which is importantly not protected by information security. So information security is concerned with PII. So designated data that's considered like personally identifiable information. So that's your date of birth, your social security number, where you live, that kind of stuff. But metadata, like the stuff that describes the data, the fact that some interaction happened, not necessarily with whom or what their names are, but an interaction happened at a certain time. That's metadata. And that's all not protected. But that's exactly the metadata that was important for Cambridge Analytica to figure out and aggregate and then re-identify and hyper-target people to get them to do exactly as somebody wanted. This is what the ad tech landscape is concerned with. It's taking metadata and figuring out who are the people that are most likely to purchase a thing when I show them the ad, without necessarily them wanting to purchase that thing, because the idea is you try to figure out who might be angry at a given time, who's feeling lonely, who needs connection. So all of these things, these human heuristics are really easy to like target if you have a large enough sample set, right? So this is really bad. It kind of destroys the trust in our institutions. It destroys like the democratically elected governments that we have. It really destroys our ability to like interact and trust one another and talk across the aisle. So we don't want it anymore. We want to be autonomous, right? We want to be self-sovereign. We want to have data ownership, right? And data sovereignty. But if we want those things in crypto, because apparently we're building crypto because we didn't like the past 20 years of platform surveillance capitalism. If we don't want those things, then we need to be very careful about what creates those things and not repeat them. So for me, those are platform lock-in. So like you're locked into a platform, you can't just take your data and move somewhere else. The data exhaust, so unchecked data exhaust, just your trail, just the things that you leave behind that you have no control over. The missing internet identity layer. So there's no way to like self-provision your own identity. If you want to interact, you're interacting through another company, such as Google or Facebook. And then consent theater, right? Consent theater, we should really get into that because it's, I think, a fascinating topic. So crypto only concerns itself with opening up the social graph. So it solves the platform lock-in problem. Okay, the data is public now. Fantastic. But what about the other three? And remember, in Cambridge Analytica, the data was already public. There was no data breach. So we're not really doing much by opening up the social graph. There's a lot more to be done.
Yeah. So the way I'm hearing this is it sounds like Web3 can fix a lot of these problems because we're all about, self-sovereignty, data ownership, all those good things that seem to go directly counter to surveillance capitalism. But I did see you tweet before that, quote, blockchain is the worst possible thing to happen to privacy protection. So
Yeah.
can you explain what you meant by that?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's one of the best things to happen, but the way we're building it is the worst thing. So blockchains are public by default, and there's a lot of projects and protocols that are building private by default blockchains or zero knowledge applications or privacy preserving ways to sign contracts, which is fantastic. It's the right way to go. But the vast majority of the space is public. So this leaks our user telemetry. The data exhaust we were talking about is leaking our user telemetry for the entire internet and anyone with a motivation and curiosity to consume, right? I just have to perform a rudimentary Etherscan search to figure out what you're into. But it's also the other thing that's kind of rough about how we're building in Web3 is the false sense of security that it gives us. Like we satisfy ourselves with saying, well, we're taking back ownership over our data and like we're good now. And so we don't need to think harder about, are we actually taking ownership over our data? Because what does ownership mean? Ownership, like if you own something, you have the right to take it back or to control who is playing with it. Like if I own this water bottle that I have here, I can give you this water bottle to borrow. I can also take it away whenever I want. When something about me via a contract interaction goes on the blockchain, I no longer have control over it in terms of access controls. So I can't gate who sees that interaction. So we're talking about data ownership only at rest whenever it's something that is about me and I haven't shared it with anyone. But as soon as I share it with someone on a blockchain, it's no longer owned by me. And so we're not actually taking control over our data. We're actually just exposing it for everybody to see, which was, again, the same thing that led to Cambridge Analytica scandal, poorly architected privacy protections. So if we want to have a real conversation about data ownership, we have to be talking a lot more seriously about permissions, access controls, the ability to determine who sees something about me or an interaction that I'm having, under what conditions, when. Those are the kinds of things that give us control. And that's actually what ownership means, is that you actually have control over things that you own that are about you.
So, what does this look like in practice in your mind? Is it that blockchain should be private by default? Maybe our Etherscan should be private, only viewable to us, and we can make public any transactions that we want people to see? Or is it still that you think, blockchain should remain public by default, but that there are certain toggles that we as the owner, like me as the owner of my wallet and my Etherscan transactions, I have control to maybe toggle private the
Yeah.
transactions that I don't want everybody to see. How do you see it playing out in practice?
In a perfect world, I see blockchains as just coordination mechanisms where you have a hash function or something like a zero knowledge proof that's pointing to information about that interaction off chain. And access to see that stuff off chain is access controlled for a specific party for a given time that is at my discretion. So we're basically reinventing compute in order to decentralize, and that's all fine and good. But we don't need to, as we're decentralizing, also put everything on chain. We can literally just have pointers that say this thing happened, but to go see it, go to this data store, and you have to have these conditions, or you have to have this NFT or this credential to be able to see it. So I think we need to be having much more serious conversations about the benefits of off-chain data, as opposed to putting everything on blockchains. Because again, we tried that. It wasn't a blockchain, it was a platform. But we put everything there, and that kind of split society wide open and led to a lot of human suffering.
Yeah, for sure. And then on the flip side too, like you mentioned, you own your water bottle, you can lend it to me, but you have the right to take it back whenever you want. That's one side. But on the other side, I think is if you wanted to give me your water bottle and say
Yeah.
like, I really don't like your water bottle and I don't want it. Like maybe you have a
Yeah.
sticker on your water bottle that I don't agree with. And I'm like, I do
Yeah.
not want this in my possession, anywhere near my possession. On blockchain, this is not possible. You can forcibly give me your water bottle at any
Yeah.
time via NFTs. If you wanted to give me an NFT of your water bottle of the stickers that you have on there that I disagree with, you can just send it to my wallet. And it's very easy. Like you said, you can, look me up and find my Etherscan, find my wallet address. It's not difficult at all. So how, from your minds, can we address this consent problem that we're seeing in blockchain?
Yeah, I think that there's a really underdeveloped space right now, and there's a product space for access controls, for decentralized access controls. And there's definitely companies that are working on this, especially now in the bear market. I'm very optimistic that they'll find their use cases, but I should be able to gate access to write to my address. And I should be able to write the conditions under what you can write to my address. And I should be able to remove anything that I want for free because I didn't put it there. But permissions and access controls is a space that we haven't really built out yet in crypto. And partly it's because we're early. I know we like to say this and it's almost trite to say it now, but it really is. We've really not developed a lot of the thinking that informs information security in centralized computing, which is like you have different access levels to people, ways to prove that you are who you say you are, that we just haven't developed in crypto.
Yeah, so when we think about our online identity, what parts of our online identity do we want to put on chain versus off chain?
I really don't know that anything needs to be on chain as part of our identity. I guess I don't see the benefit of having identity information on chain because it doesn't even matter if that identity information isn't particularly identifiable. If it's really just, where I went in the metaverse and what I bought. Like I said, 200 Facebook likes makes it possible to figure out whether you're going to divorce your partner. You don't really need a lot of information to correlate and determine what a person thinks, how they're going to vote. And you don't want that overexposure to people that you have no idea who they are. And we're not just talking about like ad tech and advertisers. Very often we're talking about malicious actors, adversaries, spammers, scammers, and foreign governments that are able to figure out what are the fault lines in our electorate. How can we further fracture the consensus in the electorate and, use it to our advantage? So I don't really see that anything needs to be on chain for blockchains to be coordination mechanisms. The more of your information that you can store in decentralized storage, the better we all are.
That makes a lot of sense. And I hope people are listening to this and thinking through it because I think people get really excited about the possibility to put everything on chain. And even, we see things like ENS, like a while ago, had their integration with one of the like identity protocols where you could link your Twitter account to your ENS and link like different parts of your identity, but all of it would be on chain. And that kind of freaked me out a little bit because I was like, I don't know that I want my Twitter account or any of my tweets to be on chain and recorded somewhere forever, right? Like, how many of us have tweeted something that we later regretted or deleted or just, like looked back on 10 years later and cringed at like how silly of a thought that was? Like, I don't know why you would want to put any of that like on chain.
I think people in crypto are just so excited about the prospect of just reinventing compute, and that makes a lot of sense. That's why I'm in this space. I don't have any prospects for fixing the current era of computing and how we interact in digital spaces. Like, I was pessimistic about it when I was in grad school. Like, nothing I came across gave me any hope for fixing privacy. Regulations always struck me as really like way too downstream from the original problem. It's like just slapping a fix on it and just hoping that the problem goes away. It's like patching ethical debt and it just accumulates. So regulations aren't a solution, right? And privacy by design, which is another paradigm, just seems like corporate social responsibility. It's like begging people to do better, which doesn't really scale. Like, you have to align incentives to outcomes if you really want to have models for human behavior that give us outcomes that we want. But, then I stumbled on decentralized identity and crypto, and I realized, okay, if we're going to reinvent everything here, this is an opportunity to actually change things from the ground up. Not when the structure's already like really ossified and like already there and you can't really change them because they just exist already. There's so much inertia. We're starting from scratch. But at the same time, most of crypto protocols are built by like 20-year-olds that don't necessarily, and that's great, but they don't necessarily have the like historical memory to think about what went wrong the last time and not repeat those things this time around. And so I'm just really excited to kind of merge some of the like historical, philosophical, and ethical paradigms that have informed our thinking about privacy in the digital age over the last like 20 to 30 years, and just start to bring that information and knowledge into crypto so we don't repeat the same mistakes again.
Right. I'm also curious, speaking of decentralized identity, DIDs, this concept of DIDs has been around for decades. It's not
Yeah.
something that's been invented over the last year, even though most
Yep.
people have only started hearing about it over the last year. So why do you think that, this idea that we're all now so hyped about that has existed for decades just hasn't caught on hasn't gotten any traction. Nobody's heard about it. Like, nobody's been excited about it for 20 years until recently.
There hasn't really been a market need. Your social login or your like login with Gmail has served the purpose that it was meant to serve. Like, it's convenient, it's fast, it's efficient. So there hasn't been a demand for reinventing how we do logins, right? The thing works. The consequences, the second order consequences, the like aggregate data exhaust, the fact that we have no control over that data, we don't think about because it's kind of abstracted away by this convenient layer of being able to log in. But now we're kind of reinventing a lot of the ways that we interact, and we have to think, well, how are we going to log into these interactions? Like, where are we going to store this information about us? We actually need to invent new ways to do that. And now it's kind of created this gap in what's available in the market, where now things like decentralized identity, or maybe they're soulbound tokens, whatever, they're filling a void in the market where we need to figure out how to log in a decentralized way and where that data gets stored. So it's really hard to disrupt a market where the needs are already fulfilled, where there's not an apparent need. But blockchains create a very apparent need to rethink how we do identity.
I think that also brings up an interesting point that maybe we are kind of willing to trade our privacy for convenience, right? Like, at what point are we like, this is so convenient that, sure, take my data, take my identity. Like, you can have whatever. Like, I don't care what's happening on the back end anymore. Like, my metadata, sure, like, take it, as long as it makes my day-to-day life easier.
Yeah, and I think this is why it's so important to not expect users to become privacy experts. Users will never become privacy experts. I won't be a privacy expert. Like, sometimes I get really exhausted on the internet and I just click accept on the cookie because I'm just trying to read the article and it's annoying me. And that's that exhaustion that is created by consent theater, right? This idea that you're really consenting to it, but not really. I'm not cognitively consenting. I'm exhaustedly consenting to it because I just want to get to the thing I want to do. This is what I really want to deal with, is like giving people actual consent over the things that they view. But people aren't going to be the ones that select that. It has to actually come from like the supply side, the developers, the people who are building products that make it easier for us to make a privacy preserving choice, that remove the need to decide between privacy and convenience by removing the incentive to collect data. This is why I do the work that I'm doing. And it's not primarily to advocate for and inform users, because the users are not supposed to be privacy experts. That's not their job. It's the people building technologies that actually need to understand what are the second order consequences of the product design choices that we're making and how do we make better choices. So really the work is with with the developer community and not with the user community. Users shouldn't have to think about this stuff. They never will.
That makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. So I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about Web3 search because that
Yeah.
is what you're working on now at your new job at Lighthouse. So when we talk about Web3 search, I think, because we don't really have any platforms yet that we can call just a Web3 search platform. So I think a lot of our listeners, a lot of people are probably still like not even sure what we mean by
Yeah.
Web3 search. So can you just start there for us?
Yeah. Well, the space is just incredibly fragmented, right? And cross-chain efforts are only part of the picture, and not to mention a pretty big security concern at the consensus level. So there's not really a place to go to search all of the blockchains and find all the NFTs and all the DAOs and all the experiences, because the data rails across all those things are very, very different. They're non-standard, so they're not interoperable. And we're going to need to figure out how to make these things kind of talk to each other and be interoperable, because the three-dimensional web is really, really different. Knowing that something exists and where to find it is not the same thing as being there. And so we have to figure out how to power like frictionless mobility, allowing users to jump from one world to the other. It's a really powerful concept, but it requires like this really purpose-built technology and integrations with different ecosystems if we're going to like meaningfully displace existing Web 2 internet search engines and like really reinvent one of the foundational internet layers, which is navigation. And so at the heart of the issue of search are three things that are really near and dear to me. It's interoperability and common standards. And I could explain why interoperability is so key to like human flourishing. And then avatar and user identity across worlds. And then the contextual privacy in immersive spaces, that's really important. Like search is at the heart of a lot of what went wrong with Web 2, particularly with the ad tech landscape and monetization of data exhaust. So how do we search for things, experiences, and people in ways that preserve the privacy and consent of the humans that are involved, that produce those interactions, that produce those experiences? So in figuring out this work at Lighthouse, which is building the navigation engine for the open metaverse, we have to deal with a lot of the foundational questions around how to build agentic technology, which is interoperability, user identity, and privacy.
So, what does a Web3 Google look like to you? I've actually thought about this question, for months, and I don't think I've really come to something like how do we have a search engine as powerful as Google
Yeah.
without tracking people's data, without, using the current model that they're using?
Well, the first and easiest way to think about like bridging the idea from like Web 2 search to Web 3 is to conceptualize like the navigation for the spatial web as almost like Google Maps and not Google search. So you're looking at landing places instead of landing pages. Like, so you know how you use Google Maps and you're like, okay, this is the pet shop I was looking for. And now I can just go right to the website. So you're kind of navigating spatially instead of navigating web pages. And I think that in the future, in a very not so distant future, we're going to be able to jump from place to place and move to where we find people that are like us or that are doing the things that we're interested in doing. How do we do this in a way that preserves human autonomy? The only way that I see this actually working is if the identity layer is well architected and self-sovereign. So I, as the internet user, have several avatars that map to my identity wallet or to my address. I can determine when I'm searchable and when not, under what conditions, what aspects about my interactions can be searched and which ones cannot be. So it all has to come back to the individual user. It can't even be at the world level. Why? Because so right now we use on average, like 10 platforms every day. How many of those platforms have we read the terms of service for? Like none, right? Or like even figured out, got familiar with like the menu of options that we have for our privacy settings or our like sharing settings. Like there's 10 of them and that's already exhausting. In the metaverse, think about it. It's like hundreds, 1,000, 1,000, 10,000 worlds. We won't really know. If it's really built as an open metaverse, it's all these different world builders coming together and creating experiences that you can just navigate between, spatial navigation. You're not going to like land in a different landing page, like it's kind of like the Google Maps idea. Like you land in a new world and then you have to read the terms and figure out what the menu options are, what optionality you even have to control your settings. This becomes very quickly impracticable, right? When you think about just 10 platforms we use today to 100 to 1,000 to the whole open metaverse. So the only like reasonable way, the only workable way for us to manage anything to do with privacy and consent is if it's centralized around the individual. If I have some sort of like control center available to me and I just toggle different things and I set my preferences and I say, okay, for interactions that fit this criteria and overall, this is my default. And then the worlds read my data. Since they want me there, since I'm the user that they want, they should actually adjust the experience that they serve to me based on what I declare to them. I shouldn't adjust my privacy boundaries or my experience based on a term of service sheet that was written by a bunch of lawyers. You need me, so adapt to me and respect my autonomy here. And then by the time that gets downstream to search, all that I'm able to search is what's already been allowed by the end user from the very beginning, not what's been forced on the end user by the world or the 100 or 10,000 worlds that we're going to have in the metaverse. And certainly not entirely open forever for all to see the way it is currently in blockchains, where people have no control over what is shown by them. And so therefore, we don't have data sovereignty. We don't have data ownership, because if you have no way to revoke something about you, to take something away that actually belongs to you and your information belongs to you, it describes you, then we don't have a self-sovereign internet. We just have a very, 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 very large version of Cambridge Analytica that's immutable for everyone, forever.
That's fascinating. So I guess my follow-up question to that then is, how do these platforms or worlds, as you call them, or how do these things make money? Like, what's their business model?
Wow. So that should be a whole other podcast episode. My instincts tell me that a lot of the business models for monetization of any sort haven't been invented yet, in the same way that social media marketing wasn't invented until after Facebook even came about. Like, we didn't have that business model available as a concept to us to even think about. Zuckerberg built it, and then there was no evident way to actually make money. Sheryl Sandberg comes in and figures out what we now understand to be kind of, she didn't invent surveillance capitalism, but the ad model for Facebook came from her team. In the same way, I think in Web3, we first have to architect not for how to financialize it, but how to respect human dignity, human autonomy, the conditions that enable trust and like natural congregation among our friends, instead of like the forced congregation of like algorithmic targeting that looks for people who are angry or depressed and gives them exactly what they need to feel even more like that, so that they go buy the thing or vote a certain way. But one thing that I do see already emerging is that I think brands are just going to have a much more authentic and real relationship with their fans, not their consumers and their customers, but their fans. And a lot of the like commercial relationship will be built on declaratively stated preferences. Like, I can declare I'm looking for sneakers right now, or I'm looking for like bed sheets, and I can then remove that when I don't want it. And then I'm not served a bunch of bed sheets and sneakers that I didn't want. So it's not based on like correlation analysis of my prior behavior data and my like patterns and how many friends I have that also buy bed sheets. And so they'll serve me bed sheets, which is how it happens now in ad tech. It'll be based on, I've declared that I really care about, the Nike brand, or I really care about Volkswagen, and I build a relationship with that brand. And that relationship is based on trust and declared preferences, not inferred preferences.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense. Wow. All right. Well, Anastasia, this episode has given me a lot to think about. Do you have any final thoughts, anything that you want to leave our listeners with that we haven't talked about yet, or just any final thoughts you want to leave people with?
Sure. Well, I assume by the time this airs, I will have actually clicked publish on my latest Mirror article, which is just this giant opus of what my thesis was about: how to end surveillance capitalism in blockchain. It's actually addressing those four things, those four primitives that give rise to surveillance capitalism. So, platform lock-in, crypto does that. Cool. We opened it up. The missing internet identity layer, I talk about decentralized identity and how that can fix that primitive. Unchecked data exhaust, meaning we need to have confidential, private by default interactions on blockchains. And then consent theater. So to address consent theater, we need interoperability and agentic user governed preferences. So that's all in my thesis. I'll click publish probably this weekend. Check me out on anna.mirror.xyz.
Perfect. And then last quick thing, we end every episode with a little game called This or That. It's really easy. I give you 2 words, A or B, and you just tell me which one you prefer. There's no explanation needed. We're just gonna blow through this super quick. It's meant to be a quick lightning round, and I've got 10 pairs of words for you. All right, first one, Bitcoin or Ethereum?
Bitcoin,
Crypto or Web3?
crypto,
DAOs or NFTs?
DAOs,
Bear market or bull market?
bear market,
Working or learning?
learning, always,
On-chain or off-chain?
off chain,
Okay, policy or tech?
tech,
Books or podcasts?
I wouldn't say books, but podcasts. Who has
No, you
time?
can say books. It's okay. It's okay. Plenty of people say books. You're allowed to say books. Okay. Next one, past or future?
Future,
And then last one, Earth or space?
space.
Okay, cool. All right, congrats. Well, thank you so much again, Anastasia. Everybody go to ana.mirror.xyz to read all of Anastasia's writings. And then what are you on Twitter? Anastasia U on Twitter,
Yep,
right?
that's it.
Anastasia U on Twitter to follow her and keep up with everything that she's working on. And then Lighthouse, where can people go to check out Lighthouse? Is it live yet, or are you guys still building in stealth?
The product, but I think it's Lighthouse Co. _ XYZ.
Okay.
You also just Google Lighthouse CoinDesk and find the press release about what we're building. So that's actually a really good place to start.
Oh yeah, true. Using Web2 search to learn about the Web3 search platform.
Ironic,
Okay. Well,
building Web3 search.
ironic, but we'll get there eventually. All right. Well, thanks again so much, Anastasia. Thank you everybody for tuning in, and we'll be back again soon with another episode of Rehash.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Rehash, a Web3 podcast. The guest in this episode, Anastasia, was nominated by Karsten and voted onto the podcast by Tyler Internet, Zaji, and Tim. Some of the questions you heard were submitted by Karsten. Rehash is hosted by Diana Chen, produced and edited by Ellie Dots and Tyler Internet, and as always, supported by Rehash DAO. To stay up to date on all things Rehash, you can follow us on Twitter at RehashWeb3 and join our Discord to get involved.